The metal chair felt cold against Zethka's blue-scaled skin as he sat in the small white room on Kepler Station. His forearms rested on the table, fingers tapping nervously against the smooth surface while 3 investigators from the Galactic Council watched him with careful eyes. The Catherian warrior had fought in 17 major battles across 6 different star systems, but today his hands shook like a scared child. "Tell us about the humans," said the lead investigator, a tall being with gray skin and large black eyes that never seemed to blink. Zethka's throat made a low, clicking sound, which was how his people showed fear. "You do not understand what you are asking. These are not memories that any warrior should carry." The room stayed quiet except for the soft hum of the air recycling system. Outside the single window, stars moved slowly past as the station continued its orbit around the dead planet below. Zethka looked at those stars and remembered when space felt safe, when war had rules that everyone followed. "Start with New Dakota," the investigator said in a patient voice. The alien commander closed his eyes and his scaled forehead wrinkled as the memories came flooding back. "The Hegemony Alliance hired us for what they called a simple job. Humans had settled on 12 frontier worlds without permission. Our task was to remove them and claim the planets for proper civilization. We were told humans were primitive, barely capable of space travel. The entire operation was supposed to take 6 standard weeks." Zethka opened his eyes and stared at the table. "I commanded 3,000 of our finest warriors. We had conquered the Vorthan Empire in half that time with half those numbers. Humans were supposed to be easy prey." The ship's journey to New Dakota had taken 18 days through hyperspace. During that time, Zethka studied everything the Alliance had given him about humans. They were young as a species, having discovered faster than light travel only 50 years before. Their technology was basic, their military structure simple. Most importantly, they followed something called the Geneva Convention, which seemed to put limits on how they could fight wars. "We expected them to surrender when they saw our ships," Zethka continued. "Most species do." The sight of a Catherian battle fleet has ended conflicts before they began on dozens of worlds. But as their ships dropped out of hyperspace above New Dakota, something felt wrong. The human colony had been established for 12 years, with about 50,000 people living in 3 main cities, connected by a network of smaller settlements. Intelligence reports said they had minimal military forces, maybe 2,000. Poorly trained militia with outdated weapons. "Captain Jake Martinez was the human military commander," Zethka said, his voice getting quieter. "A small man, maybe half my height, with dark hair and scars on his face. When we sent the standard surrender demand, he responded immediately. The human's message had been short and simple. Come and take it." Zethka's second-in-command, a veteran named Klexmore, had laughed at the response. "Brave little creatures," he had said. "They will make good slaves once we break their spirit." The initial attack plan was straightforward. Orbital bombardment would disable their power grid and communications. Then landing forces would secure the 3 cities while fighter squadrons prevented any escape attempts. Standard pacification doctrine that had worked on hundreds of worlds. The bombardment began at dawn on the human world. Zethka remembered. Our plasma cannons struck every military target we could identify from orbit. Their small spaceport, the militia barracks, the communications tower, the power plant. Everything went exactly as planned. But when the first wave of Catherian dropships descended through the atmosphere, they found something unexpected. The humans were not hiding in their cities waiting to surrender. Instead, they had vanished into the countryside, taking their weapons and supplies with them. Martinez had evacuated the entire population during the night, Zethka explained. 50,000 people had disappeared into the forests and mountains like they had never existed. Our thermal scanners found nothing. Our motion detectors showed only local wildlife. The landing force secured empty cities within hours. Buildings stood intact but abandoned, with no signs of panic or hasty retreat. It was as if the humans had simply chosen to stop existing in places where Catherian forces could find them. Klexmore had been confident this was temporary. They are hiding like frightened animals. When they get hungry and cold, they will come back to beg for mercy, but the humans did not come back. Instead, they began to hunt. The first attacks came 3 days after landing, Zethka said, his 4 hands now gripping the edge of the table. Patrol units reported equipment failures, vehicles breaking down, communication blackouts in certain areas. Nothing serious at first. We assumed it was the primitive nature of the human world affecting our technology. Then the bodies started appearing. Sergeant Vexta was found on the 4th day, Zethka continued. He had been on perimeter guard duty at Landing Zone Alpha. We found him hanging from a tree, but not killed by any weapon we recognized. The humans had somehow made him strangle himself with his own equipment harness. The investigators leaned forward, interested. This was not how war was supposed to work. In civilized conflict, soldiers died from energy weapons or explosives or vehicle crashes. They did not die from psychological manipulation. The medical examination showed no external injuries, Zethka went on. No drugs in his system, no signs of physical torture. Somehow, the humans had convinced a trained Catherian warrior to kill himself. We could not understand how this was possible. More incidents followed quickly. Sentries would abandon their posts and walk into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Supply convoys would arrive at their destinations with drivers who could not remember the journey and cargo that had been replaced with local rocks. Entire patrol squads would return to base walking in perfect formation but unable to speak or respond to commands. On the 7th day, we finally encountered humans in direct combat, Zethka said. A supply column was ambushed in the Copper Canyon region. 24 Catherian soldiers with full battle armor and heavy weapons against what our scouts estimated as maybe 8 human fighters. The ambush had lasted exactly 4 minutes. When reinforcements arrived, they found all 24 Catherians dead or unconscious. The human attackers had vanished, but they had left something behind. They had arranged our soldiers' bodies to spell out a message in our own language, Zethka whispered. It said, "Welcome to Earth," but we were not on Earth. We were on New Dakota, 60 light years from their home world. The investigators exchanged glances. This was not normal behavior for any known species. That night, Captain Martinez sent us another message, Zethka concluded. He said the real war was about to begin. Zethka's voice grew quieter as he continued his story, his blue scales seeming to darken in the artificial light of the interrogation room. The investigators watched as one of his 4 hands traced nervous patterns on the metal table while he spoke about the things that still haunted his dreams. After the ambush in Copper Canyon, everything changed, he said slowly. We thought we understood war. In every conflict across the galaxy, there are rules that civilized species follow. You fight military targets, you protect civilians, you treat prisoners with respect. Even our ancient enemies, the Vorthans, followed these basic principles. The lead investigator nodded and made notes on his datapad. But humans were different. They were not just different, Zethka replied, his throat clicking with distress. They were something that should not exist in a rational universe. I need to tell you about Lieutenant Amy Brooks. Brooks had been identified through intercepted communications. As a human combat engineer, trained in construction and demolition work before the war started. Intelligence reports suggested she was 26 years old, originally from a place called Ohio on Earth, with experience building civilian infrastructure on frontier worlds. We expected her to use explosives and demolition charges like any normal engineer, Zethka explained. What we found instead was something that violated every concept of honorable warfare. The first sign of Brooks' work came when a Catherian patrol tried to cross the Sweetwater River using what appeared to be a perfectly normal bridge. The structure looked solid and had been checked by their own engineers for obvious traps. But when the lead vehicle reached the center span, the entire bridge somehow folded in half like a closing book, dropping the patrol into the rushing water below. The bridge was not destroyed, Zethka said, his voice filled with confusion even now. It had been redesigned. Brooks had somehow modified the support structure so that weight in the wrong place would trigger a complete geometric transformation. Our engineers studied the wreckage for days and could not understand how she had done it. But that was only the beginning. Brooks seemed to view the entire planet as a weapon waiting to be used. She turned water treatment plants into poison gas, factories by introducing chemicals that reacted with Cytherian biology. She modified mining equipment to create artificial earthquakes that would swallow entire encampments. Most disturbing of all, she somehow convinced the local wildlife to attack Cytherian forces. The creatures on New Dakota were harmless herbivores, Zethka continued. Large, gentle animals that the human colonists had been raising for food. But Brooks had done something to them. She had created modified pheromones that made these peaceful animals see Cytherians as threats to their young. The result was nightmare fuel for a warrior species that prided itself on being apex predators. Herds of massive creatures would charge Cytherian positions with suicidal fury, ignoring energy weapons and explosives to reach their targets. Even when the animals were killed, their deaths released more pheromones that attracted scavengers and predators from hundreds of kilometers away. We had to abandon 3 forward operating bases because Brooks had turned the entire ecosystem against us, Zethka said. The very air smelled like death to these creatures when we were present. Then there was Sergeant Pete Morrison. Morrison led what humans called a psychological warfare unit, but the term did not adequately describe what he actually did. The Cytherian warrior code emphasized honor, courage, and protection of the young. Morrison seemed to understand these values better than many Cytherians and used them as weapons. His favorite tactic was the crying children, Zethka said, his 4 hands now gripping the table so tightly that his claws left marks in the metal. Morrison would place audio recordings in abandoned buildings, sounds of human infants in distress. Our patrol leaders knew it was a trap, but Cytherian instincts are very strong when it comes to protecting young ones. The recordings were perfect reproductions of genuine distress calls, impossible to ignore for a species that had evolved complex parental behaviors. Cytherian soldiers would investigate despite direct orders not to, and would find buildings rigged with explosives or filled with toxic gas or designed to collapse in specific ways that maximized casualties. Morrison studied our culture, our biology, our psychology, Zethka explained. He knew that Cytherians cannot tolerate certain sound frequencies. He knew that we have excellent night vision but poor depth perception in bright light. He knew that we feel physical pain when we hear sounds of infant distress from any species. The psychological warfare escalated rapidly. Morrison's unit began broadcasting fake distress calls from captured Cytherian soldiers, voices that sounded exactly like comrades calling for help. They created holographic projections of Cytherian young in danger, knowing that warriors would risk everything to save children even when they knew it was impossible. The worst part was that Morrison never seemed angry, Zethka said quietly. When we finally captured one of his operatives, the human just smiled and asked if we were enjoying the war. He seemed genuinely curious about our reactions, like we were test subjects in some kind of experiment. But the thing that truly broke Cytherian morale was discovering that humans could continue fighting under conditions that should have been impossible. During the Battle of Miller's Creek, Zethka personally witnessed human soldiers operating with injuries that would have incapacitated any other species. I saw a human female continue fighting with a broken spine, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She could not walk, so she crawled. She could not use her legs, so she used her arms. She should have been unconscious from pain, but she kept firing her weapon until her ammunition ran out. Another human soldier had lost an arm to a plasma blast, but had somehow stopped the bleeding and continued operating equipment that normally required 2 hands. A third had been partially blinded by an explosion, but was still providing accurate sniper fire by using sound and smell to locate targets. They seemed to get stronger when they were hurt, Zethka continued. Like pain was fuel for them instead of a limitation. Our medical officers could not understand how they remained conscious, much less combat effective. The investigators looked at each other with concern. This description matched reports from other fronts where human forces had been encountered, but seeing it laid out in such detail was disturbing. "There is more," Zethka said, noting their expressions. "What I have told you so far was just the beginning. The real horror started when we tried to take their underground cities." The room grew colder as Zethka continued his account, or perhaps it only felt that way as the memories grew darker. His scaled skin had taken on a pale blue color that the investigators recognized as a sign of deep trauma in Catherian physiology. When he spoke about the siege of New Angeles, his four hands trembled constantly. "New Angeles was the largest human settlement on New Dakota," he began slowly. "Nearly 20,000 people lived there before the war started. When we finally reached the city after 6 weeks of fighting in the countryside, we found it completely empty. Every building was intact, every street was clean, but there was no sign of human life anywhere. The Catherian forces had approached the city carefully, expecting traps and ambush at every turn. But the humans had seemingly vanished without a trace, leaving behind a perfectly preserved but completely abandoned urban center. The power was still running, the water system still functioned, and fresh food was still in the markets. It was like walking through a museum," Zethka explained. "Everything was exactly as it should be except for the complete absence of people. Our sensors showed no life signs, our thermal imaging found nothing. Even our chemical detectors could not locate any trace of human scent. Commander Klexmore had been suspicious but practical. If they want to give us a city without fighting, we will take it. The underground facilities will make an excellent command center." That decision had been the beginning of the end for Catherian forces on New Dakota. "The first disappearance happened on our second night in the city," Zethka continued. "Private Nexvier was on patrol in the commercial district. His communicator went dead at exactly midnight. When the relief patrol arrived at dawn, they found his equipment neatly stacked in the middle of the street, but Nexvier was gone. The search for the missing soldier revealed something that should have been impossible. The patrol's route had been carefully planned to avoid obvious hiding places, and security cameras showed Nexvier walking normally until he simply stepped around a corner and vanished. The cameras on the other side of that corner showed no one emerging. We began to realize that the humans had not abandoned the city," Zethka said quietly. "They had moved into it in ways we could not detect or understand. Dr. Helen Carter had been a xenobiologist before the war, specializing in the study of alien life forms for peaceful research purposes. Intelligence reports described her as a quiet academic who spent most of her time in laboratories studying plant samples and mineral formations. The reports had been completely wrong. Carter had spent months studying captured Catherian equipment and biological samples," Zethka explained. "She understood our weaknesses better than our own medical officers. Everything she created was designed specifically to exploit the differences between human and Catherian biology. The first weapon Carter deployed was sound-based. Catherians used a form of natural echolocation to navigate in darkness and confined spaces, similar to the way some Earth animals could see with sound waves. Carter had developed sonic generators that produced frequencies that disrupted this ability completely. Imagine suddenly going blind in the middle of a battle, Zethka said. Our soldiers would enter a building or tunnel and immediately lose their ability to sense their surroundings. They would stumble around helplessly while human fighters attacked from directions they could not perceive. But Carter's sonic weapons were just the beginning. She had also created chemical agents that attacked Catherian scales, causing them to become brittle and painful. The chemicals were colorless and odorless to humans but caused severe allergic reactions in Catherian respiratory systems. Worst of all, the agents were designed to become more potent when mixed with Catherian sweat and blood. Our own bodies became weapons against us, Zethka said with obvious disgust. The harder we fought, the more our own biology worked to weaken us. The underground war became a nightmare of constant fear and confusion. Catherian patrols would enter subway tunnels or basement complexes and find themselves in maze-like environments that seemed to change layout between visits. Corridors would lead to dead ends that had been open passages the day before. Stairways would go up when they should have gone down. Emergency exits would open onto solid walls. Carter had somehow modified the infrastructure of the entire city, Zethka explained. She used retractable walls, rotating floors, false ceilings that could be raised or lowered remotely. The humans could reconfigure their hiding places faster than we could map them. But the most disturbing development was what the humans called corpse walkers. Carter had been experimenting with advanced medical techniques that could revive recently deceased humans under specific conditions. The results were soldiers who felt no pain, needed no rest, and could not be killed by conventional weapons. Captain Roy Evans was the first one we encountered, Zethka said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Our intelligence said he had been killed 3 weeks earlier in a bombing raid. But there he was, leading an assault on our command post, moving with impossible speed and strength. Evans looked almost normal at first glance, but closer examination revealed the horrible truth. His skin was gray and cold, his eyes were completely black, and he moved with jerky, unnatural motions like a broken machine. Most terrifying of all, he was clearly aware of his condition and seemed to find it amusing. Evans spoke to us during the attack, Zethka continued. He said that death was just another tool that humans could use in war. He thanked us for teaching his people that there were no rules in this conflict. The corpse walkers were nearly indestructible. Energy weapons that would have vaporized normal humans barely slowed them down. Explosives that could destroy vehicles might remove an arm or leg, but the creatures would continue fighting until they were completely dismembered. Even then, severed hands would continue trying to grab weapons or pull pins from grenades. We captured one of them for study, Zethka said. Our medical team spent days trying to understand how it functioned. The creature had no heartbeat, no breathing, no normal brain activity. But it could still think, still plan, still hate. It kept asking when we were going to surrender. The psychological impact on Catherian forces was devastating. Warriors who had faced death bravely in dozens of battles became paralyzed with fear at the thought of fighting enemies who could not truly die. The concept violated everything they understood about the natural order of life and death. By the 4th week of the siege, half of my soldiers were showing signs of what humans call battle fatigue, Zethka concluded. They would not eat, could not sleep, and jumped at every shadow. Some began talking about requesting transfers to easier assignments like fighting the Vorthan Empire or containing the Plague Worlds. The lead investigator made more notes and looked up with obvious concern. How did the siege end? Zethka's 4 hands curled into fists. It did not end. It got worse. Zethka's breathing became irregular as he reached the most difficult part of his story. His forearms wrapped around himself in a defensive posture that the investigators had never seen from a Catherian warrior before. The blue scales on his face had turned almost white, and his eyes darted around the room as if he expected human soldiers to emerge from the walls at any moment. The breakdown of my forces began slowly, he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Catherians are bred for war across thousands of generations. We do not fear death, we do not retreat from battle, and we do not abandon our posts, but humans somehow changed all of that. The first signs had appeared among the younger soldiers who had never fought in major campaigns before. They would wake up screaming from dreams they could not remember, refuse to enter buildings without backup, and constantly check corners and shadows for enemies that were not there. The veterans had dismissed it as inexperience until the condition spread to battle-hardened warriors. Sergeant Kexrow had fought in the Vorthan Wars for 15 years, Zethka explained. He had personally killed over 200 enemy soldiers and earned decorations for bravery in 7 major battles. But after 2 weeks fighting humans, he could not hold a weapon without his hands shaking. The medical officers had no explanation for what was happening. Catherian physiology did not include mechanisms for the kind of psychological trauma that humans seemed to inflict simply by existing. Their brain chemistry was different. Their neural pathways were organized for aggression. and survival, and their emotional responses were controlled by logic and training. Dr. Vexna examined dozens of affected soldiers, Zethka continued. She found no physical injuries, no chemical imbalances, no neurological damage, but something fundamental had changed in their minds. They described feeling emotions that our language does not have words for. The breaking point came during the final assault on Firebase 7, which the humans had established in the ruins of what used to be New Angeles Municipal Airport. Intelligence reports suggested that Colonel Lisa Wright commanded approximately 300 human fighters using the underground tunnel network to launch surprise attacks against Cytherian positions. Wright was different from the other human commanders, Zethka said, his voice growing more strained. The others used tactics and weapons and technology against us. Wright used something else entirely. The assault began at dawn with standard Cytherian battle doctrine, artillery bombardment to soften defensive positions, followed by armored vehicles and infantry advancing in coordinated waves. The humans should have been overwhelmed within hours by superior numbers and firepower. Instead, something impossible happened. The humans began screaming, Zethka said, his four hands now gripping the table again. Not battle cries or war chants like normal warriors might use. They were screaming with pure terror and rage and pain, but they kept fighting while they screamed. The sound was unlike anything in Cytherian experience. Their own species made noise during combat, but it was controlled and purposeful. Human screaming was raw emotional expression that seemed to come from some primal part of their minds that had never been touched by civilization or reason. Our soldiers stopped advancing, Zethka continued. They could not understand what they were hearing. It sounded like torture, like madness, like souls being torn apart. But the humans making these sounds were still operating weapons and coordinating attacks and thinking tactically. But the screaming was only the beginning. Colonel Wright had somehow taught her forces to weaponize their own psychological trauma. Every human fighter carried recordings of their worst memories, their deepest fears, their most painful losses. When they activated these devices, the emotional content was broadcast directly into the minds of nearby Cytherian soldiers. I felt it myself, Zethka said, his voice cracking. Suddenly I was experiencing the death of human children, the destruction of human homes, the terror of human civilians fleeing from war zones. But these were not my memories, and they were not happening to my people. The humans had somehow made their own pain into a weapon. Cytherian brain structure had no defense against this kind of attack. Their minds were organized for logic and efficiency, not for processing the chaotic emotional storms that humans seem to carry as normal psychological equipment. Warriors who had never felt fear suddenly experienced terror so intense they could not stand. Veterans who had killed thousands suddenly felt overwhelming guilt for actions they had never committed. Half of my assault force was incapacitated within the first hour, Zethka explained. They were curled up on the ground, crying and shaking, and begging for the pain to stop. Our medics could do nothing because there were no physical injuries to treat. The humans pressed their advantage with tactics that defied every principle of warfare. Instead of trying to kill Cytherian soldiers, they focused on capturing them alive and forcing them to experience more human memories. Each captured warrior became a broadcasting station for human trauma, spreading the psychological contamination to their former comrades. I watched my best officers, warriors who had served with honor for decades, reduced to helpless children by human emotions, Zethka said. They would not fight, could not think clearly, and kept asking why they felt so sad when nothing bad had happened to them personally. The most horrifying moment came when Staff Sergeant Danny Rodriguez appeared at the command post. Intelligence files showed that Rodriguez had been captured 3 days earlier during a failed reconnaissance mission. He should have been in a detention facility undergoing interrogation. Instead, he was standing outside the command bunker with his hands raised in apparent surrender. He looked normal, Zethka said, his voice barely audible now. No obvious injuries, no signs of torture or coercion. He said he wanted to exchange information about human defensive positions in return for better treatment of captured civilians. The meeting was supposed to take place in a secured room with full surveillance and multiple guards present. Standard procedure for prisoner interrogations that had been used successfully for centuries, but Rodriguez was not a normal prisoner. He moved faster than any human should have been able to move, Zefka continued. One moment he was sitting calmly at the table, the next moment he was tearing through the guards like they were made of paper. He was laughing while he killed them, not with joy, but with a kind of insane desperation. The security recordings showed Rodriguez destroying the command center's main computer systems, communications equipment, and tactical displays in less than 4 minutes. When reinforcements arrived, they found him sitting quietly in the wreckage, apparently waiting to be recaptured. He said that humans had learned something important about war, Zefka whispered. He said that the only way to win was to become something worse than death itself. The investigators exchanged worried glances as they realized the implications of what they were hearing. This was not just a military defeat, but something that challenged the fundamental assumptions about how intelligent species should behave. That was when I ordered the retreat, Zefka concluded. My forces were broken, my officers were psychologically damaged, and the humans were becoming stronger with every battle. We had not just lost the war. We had lost our understanding of what war could be. The silence in the interrogation room stretched for several minutes as Zefka gathered himself for the final part of his testimony. His blue scales had returned to a more normal color, but his forehands remained locked together on the table, as if he was trying to hold himself together through sheer physical effort. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the end of everything he thought he understood about the universe. The retreat from New Dakota was supposed to be orderly, he began slowly. We had protocols for tactical withdrawal that had been developed over centuries of warfare. Extract essential personnel first, destroy sensitive equipment, establish defensive positions to cover the evacuation of remaining forces. It should have taken 72 hours to complete. But nothing about the human war had followed normal patterns, and the withdrawal was no exception. As soon as the first Catherian ships began lifting off from the planet's surface, the humans seemed to know exactly what was happening. They did not try to prevent the retreat or inflict maximum casualties on the departing forces. Instead, they did something much worse. They watched us leave, Zefka said with obvious confusion still in his voice. Thousands of human fighters emerged from their hiding places and just stood there watching our ships depart. They did not fire weapons, they did not celebrate victory, they did not even make threatening gestures. They just watched with those strange human expressions that we could never fully understand. The sight had been deeply disturbing to Catherian soldiers who expected their enemies to either attack aggressively or hide in fear. Humans did neither. They stood in organized groups on hillsides and rooftops, perfectly visible to departing ships, making no effort to conceal their positions or protect themselves from potential bombardment. It was like they were studying us, Zefka continued, recording everything about our ships, our formations, our departure procedures. Major Chris Patterson was among them, standing in the middle of an open field where any competent military commander would have ordered an orbital strike. Patterson had requested a meeting under a flag of truce, ostensibly to discuss prisoner exchanges and the treatment of wounded soldiers. Standard diplomatic protocol required that such requests be honored even during active hostilities. Zefka had agreed to the meeting despite strong objections from his remaining officers. Patterson arrived at the designated coordinates exactly on time, Zefka remembered. He brought only a small escort and appeared to be unarmed. Everything about the meeting seemed normal until I looked into his eyes. The human major had been polite and professional throughout the negotiations, discussing details about medical care for wounded soldiers and the return of captured personnel. But while he talked, his eyes were constantly moving, taking in every detail of the Catherian evacuation procedures. He asked seemingly innocent questions about ship capabilities, crew sizes, and supply requirements. I realized later that Patterson was not there to negotiate, Zethka said. He was conducting reconnaissance on our entire military operation. Every question he asked was designed to gather intelligence about Catherian capabilities and weaknesses. The prisoner exchange had proceeded smoothly, with both sides returning captured personnel in good condition. The humans had even provided medical care for injured Catherian soldiers using their own supplies and equipment. It seemed like a rare moment of civilized behavior in an otherwise barbaric conflict. As we prepared to leave, Patterson thanked me for an educational experience. Zethka continued. He said that humans had learned much about Catherian military doctrine and looked forward to applying those lessons in future conflicts. The implications of that statement had not become clear until later intelligence reports reached the Catherian High Command. Human forces were being deployed as auxiliary units across multiple star systems where other conflicts were taking place. In every case, human soldiers quickly became the most effective and feared fighters in their respective armies. Reports came in from the Centauri campaign, the siege of Vega Prime, the border wars in the Outer Rim. Zethka explained. Everywhere humans were employed, enemy forces experienced the same psychological breakdown that had affected my soldiers on New Dakota. But the humans were not just repeating their previous tactics. They were adapting and improving their methods based on what they had learned from fighting Catherians. Each new conflict saw the introduction of weapons and strategies that were specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses of whatever species they were facing. Against the crystalline Andromedans, humans developed sonic weapons that shattered their silicon-based physiology, Zethka said. Against the hive-minded Zephyrians, they created isolation fields that severed individuals from their collective consciousness. Against the energy-based ethereals, they deployed matter disruptors that forced them into painful physical forms. The Galactic Council had initially dismissed these reports as exaggerations or propaganda from defeated enemies. No single species could possibly adapt so quickly to fighting such diverse opponents. But as more detailed accounts arrived from multiple independent sources, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Humans were not just winning battles, Zethka continued. They were fundamentally changing how warfare worked throughout the galaxy. Other species began adopting human tactics, human weapons, human approaches to psychological manipulation. The most disturbing development was the formation of what humans called mixed units that combined human soldiers with warriors from other species. These formations were vastly more effective than either group fighting alone, as if humans somehow made their allies more dangerous simply by being present. A joint force of humans and Andromedan crystals conquered the hegemony fortress at Rigel. In 18 hours, Zethka said. That same fortress had withstood siege for 6 months against purely Andromedan forces. The humans had taught the crystals how to weaponize sound in ways their own people had never considered. The final blow to Catherian confidence came when intelligence reports revealed that humans were sharing their military innovations freely with any species willing to fight against common enemies. They were not trying to build an empire or establish dominance over other races. Instead, they seemed genuinely interested in making everyone better at warfare. This was the most terrifying discovery of all, Zethka said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Humans were not trying to conquer the galaxy. They were trying to teach the galaxy how to fight like humans. The lead investigator looked up from his notes with obvious concern. What happened to your remaining forces? Half of them requested reassignment to non-combat duties, Zethka replied. The others are in psychiatric facilities receiving treatment for what human doctors call post-traumatic stress disorder. Ironically, human medical techniques are the most effective therapy for psychological damage caused by fighting humans. Zethka stood up slowly, his forearms trembling as he prepared to leave the interrogation room. I have told you everything I remember about the war on New Dakota, but I must warn you about something more important. The investigators waited for his final words. Humans are still out there, still learning, still adapting, Zethka said as guards escorted him toward the door. They have made war into an art form that no other species can match. Whatever you decide to do about them, remember this. They are not the prey they appear to be. They are predators who have learned to hunt predators. As the door closed behind the broken Catherian commander, the investigators sat in stunned silence, realizing they had just heard testimony that would change everything about how the Galactic Council viewed the young species from Earth.